Okay, so this is, gosh, what is it, the 8th lecture for this class, History 1493, and this is going to be over World War II, which will be fun for me. This is kind of my field of study. So I've deliberately set the timing on this a little shorter than usual, so I can't talk your ear off about it. All right, just like we did with World War I, we've got to start out by talking about our foreign policy leading up to that point. During the 1930s, we had this massive economic crisis going on. So foreign affairs really did not take up a whole lot of attention. When FDR became president, he made a number of changes to U.S. foreign policy specifically designed to cost us less money, basically, and to try and open up trade and just kind of not get us into the sorts of situations that we'd been in before. Like in 1933, he exchanged ambassadors with the Soviet Union, which no U.S. president had done before. They'd all refused to recognize the communist government of the Soviet Union as legitimate. Well, Roosevelt did that because he wanted to stimulate trade. Stalin had been saying, our economy's doing fine. We have plenty of jobs to go around. In fact, we've got so many jobs that we can hire Americans. And FDR was like, if your economy is that awesome, then you can buy our stuff, right? That'll help us out. Roosevelt also formalized a new policy toward Latin America, which basically said, we are no longer going to intervene in Latin American countries unless they ask us to, which is a big switch. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt had had that big stick policy, and Wilson had moral imperialism. FDR said, nope, we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to have the good neighbor policy. During the 1930s, the United States pulled our troops out of Haiti, out of Nicaragua. FDR accepted when Cuba wanted to repeal the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment was part of the Cuban Constitution since the Spanish-American War. That's the thing that allowed the United States to send troops to Cuba when the United States saw fit. And in the 1930s, Cuba decided they didn't like that anymore, and they repealed it. And FDR said, go right ahead. If you need our help, we'll be glad to send it, but we are very happy to not interfere right now. Now, those steps made it clear that the United States intended to respect the sovereignty of its neighbors, which is exactly the image that we wanted to project. Of course, behind the scenes, it was also because we didn't have the money to interfere all that much with our neighbors. But when they asked, we would send help. Roosevelt spent most of his domestic agenda criticizing what he called the economic royalists in the United States. But he was pretty cool with economic royalists in other countries, as long as they did not interfere with American business interests. So when Cuba did ask for our help, when the Dominican Republic asked for our help, when Nicaragua asked for our help, we did send them foreign aid and military aid. And when some of Roosevelt's advisors pointed out that the leaders of these nations asking for help that we were providing aid to were acting in ways that were contradictory to American values. FDR famously said about Somoza in Nicaragua, yes, I know he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. There were ominous developments happening in Asia and Europe that began to overshadow anything going on in Latin America. By the mid-1930s, it seemed pretty clear that the rule of law was basically disintegrating, that war is going to happen. In 1931, Japan invaded northern China, a province called Manchuria. They were trying to expand their military power, their economic power. Now, Japan called this program the Greater Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. This follows one of those international guidelines. If something that a country is doing uses all sorts of glowing positive words in its name, it is probably not actually a good thing. Like the People's Republic of North Korea. right? It's not a republic, and it's not actually for the people. And the Democratic Republic of the Congo, not democratic, not a republic either. And the Greater Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere that Japan was allegedly trying to spread during the 1930s was not great for Asia and did not involve any kind of co-prosperity at all. Instead, it was about Japan trying to take over basically everywhere else in Asia that they could get their hands on, starting with countries that didn't have a lot of Western allies. By 1937, Japanese troops had overrun significant parts of China. When they took the city of Nanjing, they massacred an estimated 300,000 Chinese prisoners of war and civilians. Now, this picture down at the bottom is from a children's book, a Japanese children's book published in the 1930s to explain to Japanese children why Daddy's going off to war. We're trying to build this Greater Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. And it's got this picture with Asians of all different stripes. Right? There are Koreans in there, there are Hindus, there are Sikhs, there are Taiwanese and Chinese and Japanese. And they're all marching together toward this bright and beautiful future, which in reality, the bright and beautiful future for everybody who was not Japanese was basically slave labor. Well, in Europe, there were various aggressive powers building as well. Adolf Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany in 1933. He fairly brutally consolidated power in Germany by killing off his political opponents, and then he set out on this campaign to control the entire continent. In violation of the Versailles Treaty, he began to build up German military strength. And in 1936, he started to branch out, trying to claim more territory. And he said in the beginning, he was just trying to get Lebensraum, living room. He was trying to get all of the territories that had German people or German-speaking people under the control of the German government. And people kind of said, oh, well, okay, that sounds fair. So in 1936, he sent German troops into the Rhineland. That was that zone between France and Germany that France was supposed to have control over after World War I. And Britain and the United States and even France all kind of looked away while he did it. So Hitler decided that the world's most powerful democracies either didn't care what he was doing or couldn't stop him. In Italy, their leader, their head of state was Benito Mussolini. He was the founder of fascism, which is when Nazism developed out of fascism. He invaded and conquered the nation of Ethiopia. Sort of conquered. Now you may be wondering, why the hell Ethiopia? Well, Mussolini was like Hitler in that he was obsessed with his nation's imperial past, rebuilding the old empire. And for Mussolini, that would be the Roman Empire, the ancient Roman Empire. Ancient Rome had controlled parts of North Africa, particularly Egypt. Now, Egypt in the 1930s had a very strong British and French military presence, so Mussolini is not going to invade Egypt. Ethiopia, on the other hand, had a few armored trucks and a handful of World War I era tanks. They were not militarily prepared to fight off even Italy, which honestly was not doing that great militarily. So Mussolini was pretty sure he could take Ethiopia, and he did. And the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, the guy speaking here, he went in front of the League of Nations, and he reminded them that, first of all, they are supposed to stop unprovoked aggression, like what Italy was doing. And second, they are supposed to support national sovereignty and the right of a people to have their own government. And the League of Nations listened to his speech and said nothing, which is pretty much all they ever said when one of their member nations decided that it didn't want to play nice. The League of Nations had no enforcement ability. Even if they had said, Benito, don't do that, he wouldn't have had to stop. They couldn't have made him stop. So now people are looking at the League of Nations wondering what it's good for and thinking maybe we need to get rid of it and put in its place some kind of international body that has some strength to it. In Spain, a fascist government also sprang up. In 1936, General Francisco Franco led an uprising against the democratically elected government, and Hitler gave him a lot of support. By 1939, Franco had won the Spanish Civil War, and he established the third fascist government in Europe, and the one that lasted the longest. Let's see, what else is going on? Oh, in 1938, Hitler continued with his campaign to unite all of Europe, going into another German-speaking, German ethnic region. He annexed the nation of Austria, which basically means he rolled his tanks in and said, you're ours now. And then he took a region of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland, which had a lot of ethnic Germans in it. And nobody stopped him. So shortly afterwards, he just went ahead and took the rest of Czechoslovakia too. As the 1930s went on, FDR became more and more alarmed at Hitler's aggression. He was also concerned about the rumors, what we knew and what we heard and what we didn't quite know about what was happening to Germany's Jewish population. And we knew that right after Hitler came to power, they were stripped of citizenship. We knew that they were stripped of property. We knew as the 30s progressed that they were being rounded up and forced into ghettos in the major cities. And then there were weird reports coming out of Germany, American diplomats and American journalists saying, there are like a lot of Jewish people just kind of disappearing. Like, this ghetto over here used to be full of people, and now like half of them are gone, and we don't know where they are. But we're hearing some really troubling rumors. Well, in 1937, FDR called for international action to quarantine Hitler, but nobody actually did anything. In fact, Jewish people had been trying to flee Germany since Hitler became chancellor in 1933. Hitler never tried to hide what he wanted to do. But the United States refused to change our immigration quotas, and we would not accept them as political refugees. We did not want to upset Hitler. Didn't know right at that point exactly how bad it would get. We just knew that, 1933, Roosevelt's just come to power in the United States. The first New Deal has barely started. We are still in the depths of the Depression. Pissing off another country doesn't look like the best idea. FDR is not the only world leader tiptoeing around Hitler, though. Britain and France did it as well. They called it appeasement. We'll let him take the German-speaking parts of Europe, and maybe that'll be enough for him. The Prime Minister of Great Britain, Neville Chamberlain, during the 1930s, when he came back from the negotiations that let Hitler take the Sudetenland, that part of Czechoslovakia, he announced that he had guaranteed peace in our time. Well, most Americans weren't even paying that much attention to this threat potentially coming from Japan or Germany or Italy. That seemed very distant. Whatever's happening around the world might be terrible, but it's not happening to us. And Hitler had quite a few admirers in the United States. Some Americans were so obsessed with the threat of communism that they approved of German expansion as kind of a way to counterbalance the Soviet Union. Businessmen didn't want to give up access to overseas markets. Henry Ford did business with Nazi Germany throughout the 1930s. Ford plants in Germany used slave labor provided by the German government. We continued to trade with Japan, too. We sent them American trucks and aircraft and a whole bunch of oil. And until summer of 1941, 80% of Japan's oil supply came from the United States, which in hindsight was a bit of an error. Now, many Americans still believed that we never should have gotten involved in the First World War. I mean, throughout the 1930s, investigations were held by the Senate. And that showed, arms exporters and bankers had put a lot of pressure on the Wilson administration to get into World War I, and that they made a very nice profit from that war. And folks were afraid that that's happening again. that what we are hearing about what Japan is doing and what Italy is doing and what Germany is doing are just rumors stirred up so that arms manufacturers can make more money. Isolationism, the desire to not get dragged into foreign affairs, that dominated the American public and Congress as well. Beginning in 1935, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts which said, Americans cannot travel on ships owned by nations at war. We will not sell weapons or arms in any way to countries at war. And Congress hoped that that would keep us out of this problem. I mean, if we're not traveling on British ships and we're not selling weapons, then maybe our citizens won't get attacked by German submarines again, right? And if we're not selling weapons and we're not giving loans to Great Britain, then our bankers won't be pushing us to support the war. Regular citizens who were strongly in favor of not going to war joined organizations like the America First Committee. Charles Lindbergh was one of the members of the America First Committee. They strongly believed, now, Lindbergh himself was kind of an admirer of Hitler. That's not necessarily true of everybody who was a part of this. Many of the people who were part of the America First Committee had no idea of any of the rumors coming out of Europe and really believed that any push towards war was something that would harm the United States. Not necessarily that they loved Hitler. But a very popular political cartoonist during the 1930s really enjoyed satirizing the America First Committee and their beliefs. And this is one of his cartoons. It's a nice lady wearing an America First sweater, reading a children's book called Adolf the Wolf to her kids. And the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones. But these were foreign children, and it really didn't matter. And you might recognize this style of artwork. This political cartoonist is Theodore Geisel, who will later go on to write children's books under the name of Dr. Seuss. Now, throughout the 1930s, Britain and France and most of the rest of Europe had repeatedly caved into Hitler's aggression. In 1939, the Soviet Union, Stalin and the Soviet Union, were increasingly worried that Germany would come after them, which Germany does at various times, not just during World War I. They've invaded Western Russia and the nations, Ukraine, Belarus, places like that, multiple times. So Stalin reached out to Britain and France and asked them to form an alliance with him so that the Soviet Union would have allies if Hitler decides to invade. Britain and France didn't trust Germany, they didn't trust Hitler, but they also didn't trust Stalin. In some ways, they saw Germany as, again, a counterbalance against the spread of communism, so they refused any alliance with the Soviets. And then Stalin stunned the world when he decided to sign a non-aggression pact with Hitler, his sworn enemy. Basically, the Nazi-Soviet pact said that Russia would not oppose German expansion as long as Germany doesn't try to take any Soviet territory. And Germany will not oppose any Russian expansion, any Soviet expansion, as long as they don't try to grab any German territory. So, of course, as soon as this thing is signed, both of them go in this mad scramble to try and snatch up as much territory as they possibly can so the other one can't claim it. On September 1st, 1939, immediately after signing this pact, Germany invaded Poland. Now, Britain and France had a treaty with Poland. They'd also had a treaty with Czechoslovakia. Hell, Hitler had invaded part of what was at the time French territory, and they'd never acted before. This time, with the invasion of Poland, they did. They declared war on Germany. But by this point, Germany's unstoppable. Within a year, the Nazi blitzkrieg had overrun Poland. They'd taken most of Scandinavia and Belgium and the Netherlands. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris under Napoleon's own triumphal arch. Hitler dominated almost all of Europe, as well as a significant part of northern Africa. In September of 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan joined together to create a military alliance known as the Axis. So for nearly 2 years after this, from the time that they declare war in 1939 until the United States finally comes in, Great Britain kind of stood alone in fighting Germany. Winston Churchill became the Prime Minister of Britain in 1940, and he vowed to resist any threatened Nazi invasion. We will fight them in the air, we will fight them in the beaches, we will never stop fighting. In the Battle of Britain, which lasted for months, the German Air Force repeatedly attacked the city of London and Birmingham and Coventry and other major British cities, any British city that had a significant industrial base. In fact, the Blitz over London lasted for more than 70 consecutive nights. You can see in this lower picture, it's East London with St. Paul's Cathedral, the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, rising out of the smoke of yet another attack. Now, the Royal Air Force eventually turned back the assault, but Churchill desperately called on the New World, he said, with all its power and might, to step forward and rescue the Old World. Now, FDR firmly believed that Hitler was insane, firmly believed that he posed a direct threat to the United States, but most of the American public is still really desperate to stay out of this conflict. After a very tumultuous, angry debate, in 1940, Congress agreed to allow us to sell arms to Britain, but only on a cash-and-carry basis, which means we're not going to loan them any money. We're not going to loan them any weapons. They have to pay cash on the table, and it has to be transported in British ships. See, that way, if we're not transporting weapons on American ships, then Germany has no reason to attack American ships. And if we're not loaning them money for this stuff, then our bankers are not going to encourage us to go to war. Congress also approved plans to build up the U.S. military. But Roosevelt didn't want to push it too hard. It's 1940. There is another presidential election coming up, and Roosevelt is going to do something real controversial. Again, he's going to break a tradition that goes back to George Washington. He announced that he was running for a third term as president. He said that the economic recovery is not complete. It's still too fragile. The whole world situation is too dangerous for him to leave office. You need somebody in office who knows what he's doing. And the Republican Party basically handed him the election. They ran a guy named Wendell Willkie. And Willkie really wasn't too far from Roosevelt politically. He supported a lot of the New Deal social legislation. They both supported a peacetime draft, but Willkie was absolutely a political amateur. And people were not willing to go for him in such a dangerous time. FDR won a very decisive victory. And during 1941, the United States became more and more closely allied with the nations fighting against Germany and Japan. FDR said that the United States will be the great arsenal of democracy, but Britain was nearly bankrupt. They couldn't pay for our supplies. They couldn't do the cash and carry thing anymore. So with a lot of pressure from Roosevelt, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, which is a funny little law. The Lend-Lease Act authorized us to send military aid as long as the countries we gave it to promised to somehow return it all after the war. Yes, please return all of our tanks and all of our airplanes and go out into the battlefields and gather up all those bullets. It's a little piece of legal fiction, basically. It's a way for us to have plausible deniability if Hitler accuses the United States of being part of the Allies. Then we can say, no, we're not. We're just loaning them this stuff. Under this law, the United States funneled billions of dollars worth of arms to Great Britain, to China, who's fighting against Japan. We also started aiding the Soviet Union. Turns out Hitler's not actually trustworthy. He renounced the Non-Aggression Pact, and he invaded Russia in June of 1941. FDR also in the summer of 41, authorized freezing Japanese assets in the United States, and ended most trade between our two countries, including the sale of oil to Japan. Now, those who believe that the United States need to intervene to stem the flow of fascism tried to get the country to prepare for war. But until November of 1941, our focus was mostly on Europe. We believed that Hitler was the biggest threat. But at the end of November 1941, we intercepted Japanese messages which revealed that Japan was planning an assault on some U.S. territory somewhere in the Pacific. We didn't actually know where it would happen. We were suspecting perhaps the Philippines or Guam. Those are closer to the Japanese mainland. It's easier for them to get there. They can launch their airplanes directly from Japan. Of course, that's not where it happened. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes launched from aircraft carriers in the middle of the Pacific and bombed the naval base at Pearl Harbor. It's the first foreign attack on American soil since the War of 1812. Pearl Harbor, of course, is in Hawaii. Pearl Harbor was a complete, devastating surprise. In just a few hours, more than 2,000 American servicemen and women were killed, 187 aircraft, 18 naval vessels had been damaged or destroyed. By a stroke of luck, no U.S. aircraft carriers were docked at Pearl Harbor. Now, still today, there are dumb conspiracy theories saying that FDR knew the attack was coming, knew it would be at Pearl Harbor, knew the day and the hour, and deliberately did nothing. There is no credible evidence to support this, especially since it looked like we were going to get involved in the European war. Roosevelt really did not want to stir up trouble in Asia, because if we do that, then we have a war on two fronts. We have to split our forces. It's really hard to fight a war like that. Nonetheless, to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war. And Congress authorized that declaration 477-1. Jeannette Rankin, the woman who'd voted against going into the First World War, she also voted against the Second. And the day after the United States declared war on Japan, Germany declared war on us. World War II has been called a gross national product war, which kind of means that the outcome rests on which group of countries, allies or axis, that can outproduce the other, which in retrospect seems really obvious, that whichever side has the United States will win. But the first few months that we were involved in the war was a string of military disasters. I mean, Japan had already taken over large parts of China. They already had Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, while we're still trying to put the remains of our Navy back together, Japan conquered Burma, Thailand, Indonesia, Micronesia, which it used to provide all of the oil that it wasn't getting from the United States anymore. Then it moved on to our territories like Guam and the Philippines. At Bataan in the Philippines, the Japanese forced 78,000 American and Filipino troops to lay down their arms. It's the biggest surrender in U.S. history. Thousands of men died in the march, the Bataan Death March, to the prisoner of war camps, and then thousands more died in the camps of disease and starvation. At the same time we're trying to build up and go to fight in the Pacific, German submarines are all over the Atlantic Ocean, sinking hundreds of Allied naval vessels and merchant vessels in the Battle of the Atlantic. But soon the tide started to turn. In May of 1942, was the Battle of the Coral Sea. And the American Navy managed to turn back a Japanese fleet that was trying to attack Australia. In June, the U.S. Navy inflicted a devastating defeat on a significant portion of the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway. Those victories allowed American forces to launch the island hopping campaign, go from one island battle for that, secure it, move on to the next island, secure that, move on to the next one. You know, Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima and the Solomon Islands, that will bring us closer and closer to mainland Japan. And that's something that always kind of amazes me. You know, Pearl Harbor was in December of 41, right at the end of 41. It destroyed or seriously damaged 8 battleships, 10 other major vessels. But 5 months later, the U.S. Navy was rebuilt enough not only to fight, but to win. Now, there were 2 major things that the U.S. had going for it. The first is that FDR had started to build up the military before we ever got involved. And there were a number of ships that were almost complete in shipyards on the mainland. And the second was a really amazingly fast shift away from consumer production to wartime production. Basically, every trick that U.S. industry used, had learned to produce consumer goods very quickly and cheaply and efficiently, they brought to producing goods for the military. Within days after Pearl Harbor, Navy divers were pulling up parts of destroyed ships, trying to raise the ones that might be saved, and with the help of the Ford Motor Company and U.S. Steel, the U.S. Navy was sailing again by January of 42. Now, Japan was the immediate threat. They're the ones that actually attacked the United States. It took quite a bit longer for the United States to head toward Europe. In fact, it's not going to be until November of 42 that British and American forces together will invade North Africa. And the Germans won't surrender there until May of 43. Along with that victory, by the spring of 43, the Brits and U.S. together had managed to devastate German submarine forces in the Atlantic, which made it a lot easier to move men and move supplies over to Europe. But even though Roosevelt was committed to freeing Europe from Nazi control, American troops did not immediately become involved on the European continent. Even up to the end of 44, there were more U.S. troops deployed in the Pacific than against Germany. But those troops in Europe steadily advanced. In July of 43, American and British forces invaded Sicily and began the liberation of Italy. Now, Italy is an Axis power, so you might be wondering why we call this the liberation of Italy and not the conquest of Italy. The reason we use this terminology is because it turns out that the people of Italy really didn't want to be on the Axis side. Like, the only Italian who actually wanted to be in the Axis was Mussolini. In a popular uprising overthrew Mussolini in 1943. He went into hiding. Italian troops that had been more or less forced to fight for the Germans often switched sides as soon as they could. Most of Italy was liberated by the Allies by early 44. The Germans were hanging on in the north, but aside from that, the war in Italy was over. Now, the major involvement of U.S. troops in Europe did not begin until June 6, 1944. And that is what is popularly remembered as D-Day. Nearly 200,000 American, British, and Canadian soldiers, all under the command of General Dwight Eisenhower, landed in Normandy in northwestern France. More than 1 million Allied troops followed them over the next few weeks. It's the most massive sea-to-land operation in history. After putting up some extremely fierce fighting, German troops began to retreat back east, and by August, Paris had been liberated. Some of the most crucial fighting in Europe, though, didn't actually involve U.S. troops. It took place on the Eastern Front between Germany and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's participation on the Allied side in World War II is really what largely won the war. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Hitler violated the pact that he had made with the Soviet Union in an invasion known as Operation Barbarossa. The scale of that invasion is just bonkers. 3 million men on both sides, with air and with naval support, were aligned along the German-Russian frontier. The potential area of operation covered half of Europe. Now, German commanders knew they had to hit hard, hit fast, destroy the defenders before winter came, because winter in the Soviet Union's pretty rough. They were depending on their tanks, on the Panzer divisions, to do most of the work. Unfortunately for them, Soviet infrastructure, the roads and the bridges, was so terrible that they had a very hard time of it. German troops found that they would have to repair Russian roads before their tanks could use them, and that cost them precious time. Damage to the tanks on bad roads cut the Panzer division in half in the first month of the war. Now, in the first few weeks of the invasion, German forces did capture hundreds of thousands of Russian prisoners of war. Despite this, the Russians kept fighting, and that kind of surprised the Germans. German military planners had assumed that Russian soldiers were racially inferior, and they would not be able or willing to fight back effectively. But they were so wrong. They also underestimated how easily Stalin could replace any soldier captured or killed. I mean, on the frontier of this invasion, in the first few weeks, entire divisions of the Red Army would be captured or killed. But the Germans faced no fewer soldiers. Within the first 6 weeks, despite hundreds of thousands captured, the number of Soviet divisions in the field rose from 170 to 212. And by the 17th of July, the German Army's lead panzer divisions were 350, 400 miles inside Russian territory, which stretched their supply chain to the absolute limit. And the remnants of Soviet divisions that had been devastated by the initial invasion were still kind of wandering around in the forests, wandering behind German lines, kind of picking off German troops and, tearing up roads again and making as much of a mess as they could. And between the fighting and the lack of supplies, by the end of September, the Germans had lost more than 500,000 men. Dead, captured, wounded, 500,000, 16% of their field army. And unlike Stalin, Hitler did not have endless reserves of men to keep throwing in. But in September, Hitler officially made Moscow the capital, the target. And his commanders were told to concentrate just on taking Moscow. And he told them to use the same plan as before. Send in the panzers, the infantry will follow, surround the target, and eliminate it. But just like it hadn't worked the first time, it didn't work this time. German planners, just like they hadn't counted on the abilities of Soviet soldiers, did not account for Russian geography. October in Russia is the start of the rainy season, and most of the roads weren't paved. They've actually got a word for it. It's called Rasputitsa. It's the roadless season. Masses of the German army found itself just stuck. Try and send one of those tanks down a muddy road, that tank is not going to move until the summer when you can chisel it out. And then, of course, the rainy season turns into the freezing season. German tanks and equipment could not operate in that kind of cold. Soviet equipment was built for that cold. The German commanders began to retreat, and Hitler is squalling at them the entire way. The commanders were very angry that Hitler was willing to sacrifice so many men for an objective that they simply could not manage. Of course, they did kill quite a lot of people, like up in Leningrad. Leningrad was the second largest city in the Soviet Union. The Germans started shelling Leningrad on the 1st of September. Had a population of about 2.5 million people. About 100,000 refugees from the countryside came in. On the 12th of September, they did a survey, an inventory of the food remaining in Leningrad, and discovered that they had enough meat to last for 22 days, enough flour for 25 days. They gave the meat to the soldiers, and so the civilians had none. They had flour for bread. They added brewer's malt and animal feed to the flour to try and stretch the bread out, and then they ran out of that. Then they discovered that if you strip the wallpaper off the wall, the glue on the back can be used as kind of a really gross spread. And shell packing from the artillery can be used to make flour. Of course, you're not supposed to steal the shell packing. Soldiers get really mad about that. Eventually, they were reduced to eating horses and dogs and cats, and still no relief came. Thousands of people died on Christmas Day, 1941. 3,700 people died on that one day of starvation. 52,000 people died just in Leningrad in the month of December 1941. With the Soviets so intent on defending Moscow, Leningrad had to wait for rescue, and wait, and wait. September of 41 is when the siege started. February of 44 is when it ended. 872 days. More than 1 million civilians died of starvation and disease. After sweeping through the Western Soviet Union, in 1942, German armies launched a siege of Stalingrad, which is another large city, but it's down in the south. It's in what is now Ukraine. That was a really bad move. By that point, the Soviets had gotten a massive shipment of supplies from the United States, and when the Germans surrounded Stalingrad, the Soviets surrounded the Germans and forced them to surrender. About 800,000 Germans and 1.2 million Russians died in the Battle of Stalingrad. But that surrender, the surrender at Stalingrad in January 43, marked a major turning point in the European theater. Of the 13.6 million German casualties of World War II, 10 million of them came from the Russian front. Now, that represented just a small percentage of the war's vast toll on human life. Millions of Poles and at least 20 million Russians died, not just soldiers, but civilian victims of starvation and disease and massacre. And after German armies began to penetrate Eastern Europe, Hitler embarked on what he called the final solution, the mass murder of people that Hitler believed were undesirable. Slavs and Romani, what people used to call gypsies, homosexuals, and above all, Jewish people. By 1945, 6 to 9 million Jewish men, women, and children had died in Nazi death camps. What came to be called the Holocaust was the horrifying end to the Nazi belief that Germans were a master race, destined to rule the world. So how did that even happen? How does a nation like Germany, which is industrialized, which is a civilized nation, how did they get into a place where something like that is even possible? After the war, after the First World War, ultra-conservative movements sprang up around the world, and very prominently in Germany. Many German soldiers, including a young Adolf Hitler, flocked to those right-wing movements, which promised to sort of restore the glory and the power of their nation. In Germany, the Kaiser abdicated his throne, and a republic, the Weimar Republic, took his place. But the Weimar Republic in Germany was weak. It was severely in debt, of course, had all of those limitations and restrictions put on them by the Versailles Treaty. But by contrast, the right-wing movements seemed much stronger, much more vital, much more able to turn Germany's future around. Now, the Weimar Republic had no need of soldiers that agreed to disarm in the Versailles Treaty, and these new movements gave the soldiers a place to belong, gave them a cause to fight for, gave them an enemy to fight against. Now, this particular ideology that they used, particularly the early Nazi Party, was called Dolchstoss, backstab. According to Dolchstoss, Germany didn't lose the war because of soldiers or because of lack of leadership or anything like that. Instead, they believed that the war was lost because politicians, influenced by communists and Jews, just gave up. And the Jews, because they weren't seen as being truly German, made a handy scapegoat for everything that Dolchstoss theory wanted to blame. It was really easy to blame Jews. Germany, like the rest of Europe, like the United States, had a very long history of anti-Semitism. I mean, back in the Middle Ages, if there was a crop failure or there was a plague, people were just as likely to blame Jews as witches. And the church bears quite a lot of blame for this. Violence against Jews from the Middle Ages into the modern era tended to peak between Passover and Easter, as priests and ministers reminded their congregation that, hey, it's the Jews that killed Jesus. Jews were accused of all sorts of things that today almost sound ridiculous, like kidnapping Christian children and using their blood in Passover bread. But people believed it. And when Catholics and Protestants went to war against each other, they would both burn Jewish neighborhoods along the way as part of their religious cleansing. Prosperous Jews were accused of cheating and dishonesty, and they were treated basically the way prosperous African Americans were after Reconstruction. It's an old, old hate. And it was a cheap and easy way to get people to rally against a common enemy. And when you can get people to rally against an enemy, it's easier to get them to follow you. And for some leaders of the Nazi Party, that's all it was. It was just an excuse. It was an excuse that they were willing to sacrifice millions of lives for. But Hitler in particular believed it. As early as 1919, when he was still in the German army, Hitler was publicly advocating for all Jews to be removed from Germany. Later, after he'd gotten involved in politics, he was arrested. While he was in prison, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf. And in that book, he came up with the idea of Aryan purity, this pseudo-scientific way to rationalize his hate. And he began to write about the need to murder and completely eradicate all Jewish culture in Europe. He never tried to hide what he believed. Aryanism also meant that Slavs and Serbs and Poles and Romani, anybody who wasn't sufficiently German, would also have to die. We usually estimate that about 3 million non-Jews were killed by the Nazis as part of their final solution, but the truth is that's a really low-ball estimate. Estimates can go to 5, 6, even 7 million. The 6 million Jews we can extrapolate from census records, from Nazi records themselves, because they kept excellent records. It's harder to know, like, how many physically and mentally handicapped people died. If they were not institutionalized, if they were just living at home, could basically care for themselves but were not perfect, we don't have numbers for them. They just disappeared. Communists and Union supporters were lined up and shot early on, usually in acts of mob violence, so we don't have precise numbers for them either. And all of this violence sprang out of old scapegoating, old bigotry, but it was helped along by a fairly new political philosophy known as fascism. Essentially, fascism is the complete power of the ruler. Mussolini invented it as a governmental institution, and what Mussolini wanted was power, so fascism is about his power. Every individual, every institution in the country are defined in relation to the state, to the ruler in particular. What they can provide to him, what he is willing to grant to them. There's no such thing as unalienable human rights in fascism. Like, you have the freedom to speak what the state wants you to speak when they want you to speak it. You have the freedom to follow the religion that supports the state. Fascism is undemocratic. It does not support universal suffrage. Doesn't really care that much about any suffrage because they don't care what you want. The state is everything. Fascism is inherently violent. It is inherently militaristic. It is inherently imperialistic. The state must always be expanding its power, even over other people's. Pacifism is weakness. Compromise is weakness. And the state must always be seen as strong. A lot of this is coming out of Mussolini's, personal insecurities. Now, at first, Mussolini was kind of cagey about what he wanted. When he was trying to gain support for this, he told the people of Italy that, sure, fascism can be democratic. Yeah, it can be socialist. Yeah, it can be pacifist. Once he took power, though, fascism became the root of Mussolini's power, and his power is dependent upon this. And by God, what he will allow the people to do is only what enhances his own power. Now, when Hitler came to power in Germany about a decade after Mussolini, he latched onto fascism as a way of promoting his goals, because the fascism says the state is all-powerful, and Hitler saw himself as the German state. So fascism and its inherent violence and its inherent unwillingness to see other viewpoints, inherent lack of compassion, contributed to the outbreak of war and certainly to the way that the war was prosecuted. Now back on the home front, World War II transformed the role of the American government. FDR created federal agencies like the War Production Board, the Office of Price Administration to regulate labor and, fix prices and wages and rent. The number of federal employees quadrupled, rose from 1 to 4 million, part of a tremendous growth in jobs, which also meant that unemployment hit rock bottom. In 1940, the unemployment rate was still 14%. In 1943, it was down to only 2%. The government built housing for war workers, which meant jobs in construction and electricity and plumbing and all of those consumer products that you use in your house. Civilian industries kind of retooled for war production. Michigan's car factories turned out just an unbelievable number of trucks and jeeps and tanks and airplanes. Willow Run was a Ford motor plant up in Michigan. It was so efficient that averaged over the course of the war, it turned out 13.5 B-24 bombers every day. By 1944, American factories put together produced about 1 ship every day, 1 plane every 5 minutes. The gross national product rose from $91 billion to $214 billion. Federal government spending amounted to twice the combined total of the last 150 years. The government also sold war bonds, just like we had during World War I. They increased taxes. Before the war, only about the 4 million wealthiest Americans paid income taxes. By 1945, about 40 million Americans paid federal income tax. The relationship between the federal government and big business also changed. FDR's Secretary of War told him, if you're going to go to war in a capitalist country, you better let the capitalists make money. Corporate executives were appointed to all sorts of federal agencies that handled war production. Roosevelt offered them incentives so that they would produce more. He got Congress to give them low-interest loans and tax breaks and contracts with guaranteed profits. The greatest bulk of federal spending actually went to these incentives to the biggest corporations. By the end of the war, the 200 biggest companies accounted for almost half of all corporate assets in the United States, thanks to these government incentives. Federal money created entirely new industrial centers. The West Coast became a focus of industrial production. The government invested billions of dollars in shipyards in Seattle and Portland and San Francisco, in steel plants and aircraft factories in Southern California. By the end of the war, California factories had received 10% of all federal spending. Los Angeles had become the second biggest manufacturing center in the country. The 2 million people moved to Los Angeles to take jobs in the factories, and millions more passed through for military training on their way out to the Pacific. In the South, government investment in military factories, in shipyards, in military bases helped to finally start to revitalize the Southern economy. By the end of the war, the per capita income in the South was about 70% the national average. Well, that sucks, but remember, before the war, it was only 50% the national average. Now, folks really boggled at the achievements of wartime manufacturing. There's thousands of aircrafts, 100,000 armored vehicles, 2.5 million trucks rolled off American assembly lines. Entirely new products were created, like synthetic rubber. And we used to use natural rubber, but that comes from the islands in the Pacific, which Japan controls. So we had to invent fake rubber. Government-sponsored research perfected things like radar and jet engines and early computers, and even what would be the predecessor to Wi-Fi. Now that was actually developed by a mathematician named Hedy Lamarr, who is actually better known as an actress. She was a very popular pinup girl style of actress in the 1930s and 40s. She was also a mathematical genius, and she developed the precursor to Wi-Fi during World War II. Now, all of these accomplishments made it possible to win a devastating two-front war, and it also helped to rebuild the reputation of businesses and corporations, which had really hit a rock bottom during the Depression. Labor, organized labor, the unions, they described World War II as a crusade for freedom that will expand economic democracy, political democracy around the world and at home. Kind of the same thing that they'd been told during World War I. This time, though, we had a government in place that actually would back that up. Unions believed that they could get a voice in politics, that they could get more support if they supported the war effort. So during the war, they entered into kind of this three-sided agreement with government and business and labor, all working together, that allowed union membership to grow and allowed production to just skyrocket. The government cannot be having strikes and labor stoppages, not when there's a war on that depends so heavily on industry. So they ordered businesses to cooperate with the unions. And in fact, there was an incident in 1944. Montgomery Ward, the old mail order company, they defied a pro-union order, and the Army seized their headquarters, physically evicted their president because they would not follow this order. Union leaders promised that if their employers dealt fairly with them, they would not strike. Despite the growth of labor militancy during the 1930s, World War II is where a lot of unions became really firmly established. By 1945, union membership was up to 15 million. About a third of the industrial labor force was unionized. It was still very much a junior partner, though, in that arrangement with government and business. Now, the previous wars that we've talked about, like World War I, had really deeply divided American society. But we remember World War II differently. We call this one the Good War. It's fought by the greatest generation. It's a time of national unity when we're fighting for very indisputably noble goals. But all wars have to get the patriotic motor running. And the number one idea that was used to promote the war, that the government and its public opinion makers used, was the idea of the four freedoms. In Roosevelt's 1941 State of the Union speech, he talked about a future world order that was founded on the essential human freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And during the war, these became Roosevelt's kind of go-to ideas for the Allied war goals. This is the world we're trying to build. Kind of like Wilson had his 14 points. That's the world he wanted to build. This is the world Roosevelt wants to build. The talk of freedom was everywhere in wartime America. To Roosevelt, the four freedoms expressed deep-seated American values that were worthy of being spread around the world. Freedom from fear didn't just mean peace. It meant a more general desire for security in a world that was spiraling out of control. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, those are exactly what they say on the label. But their place in the four freedoms helped to move First Amendment protections to the center of the American definition of liberty. In 1941, the United States celebrated the 150th anniversary of the Bill of Rights. FDR described those protections against tyranny as defining characteristics of American life, as central to the rights of free peoples. And during the war, the Supreme Court began to move on with their protection of civil liberties. In 1943, they reversed an earlier ruling that had said Jehovah's Witnesses had to salute the American flag. And they reversed that on First Amendment grounds. They said, no, you can't make them do it. It violates their religion. You remember the flag mania of the First World War? It would have been inconceivable conceivable back then for the Supreme Court to say, you can't force somebody to salute the flag. But during the Second World War, the court said that your individual conscience must be respected, even in war. Freedom from want was the most ambiguous of the four freedoms, but it struck a really deep chord in a nation that was just barely dragging itself out of the Depression. FDR linked that particular freedom to the American standard of living, and he promised that would continue after the war. He said that protecting the standard of living would bring real freedom for the common man. Now, the Saturday Evening Post published essays on the four freedoms, each of those essays accompanied by a painting painted by every American vet's favorite painter, Norman Rockwell. And those essays described what the freedoms were about. 3 of those essays were by very famous American authors, and they emphasized that these values were essentially American and that they were the opposite of Axis powers. For freedom from want, though, the editors chose Carlos Bulosan. At the time, he was basically an unknown Filipino poet. He had immigrated to the United States when he was 16. And Bulosan's essay talked about how the four freedoms in general, and freedom from want in particular, could inspire hope for a better future. But Bulosan also pointed out that even though President Roosevelt and the propaganda agencies of the government liked to say that these freedoms are essentially American, that there were many Americans who were still not enjoying them, particularly freedom from want. He talked about migrant workers and factory workers and victims of segregation. He said for them, freedom meant having enough to eat and sending their kids to school. Now, the political divisions created in the previous decade affected efforts to promote the four freedoms. The people who basically staffed the Office of War Information tended to be extremely liberal. And they pretty openly wanted to turn the war into a people's war for freedom. The OWI, the Office of War Information, thought that most Americans had only a vague idea of the war's purpose and were more interested in getting revenge on Japan for the attack on Pearl Harbor than in getting rid of fascism. So the OWI used radio and film and other media to give the war an ideological basis, while at the same time trying to avoid that nationalist hysteria that we had back during World War I. A wartime mobilization drew on deep-seated American traditions. Critics of the OWI, though, said that they were spending too much time trying to promote Roosevelt's personal idea of freedom, and not enough time building support for the war effort. And one of the first OWI pamphlets listed the essential parts of freedom, like the right to a job with fair pay, the right to adequate food and clothing and shelter and medical care. And Congress worried that the OWI was spending more time promoting New Deal social programs than promoting war support, so they cut most of its funding. After Congress keelhauled the OWI, the selling of the war became mostly a private business. The War Advertising Council coordinated a bunch of different companies who joined in the campaign to promote wartime patriotism, while at the same time positioning themselves and their brands to gain publicity and support that will hopefully last once the war is over. Their advertisements urged Americans to buy war bonds, to keep military secrets secret, to grow victory gardens so that commercial crops could be sent to the Army. But they also wanted to advertise the corporation's definition of freedom as well. The National Association of Manufacturers bombarded Americans with radio programs and advertisements about freedom of enterprise. They used the amazing amount of wartime production to prove that free enterprise is the way to go. while conveniently ignoring the fact that wartime industry was heavily controlled, heavily subsidized, and heavily supported by the government. But after 13 years of depression, Americans on the home front began to have a prosperity that a lot of young adults couldn't even remember. I mean, say you're 18 and you're going off to fight in this war. You were 5 when the Depression started. Your entire remembered life has been nothing but depression. Not having enough to eat, not having a vehicle, maybe not having shoes. Now, despite the fact that we did have to ration during the war, consumers were actually able to buy more stuff than they could when the war first started. Yeah, we got to ration it, but people have jobs. People have money. They can buy the stuff if they've got the ration ticket for it. Businessmen said that a post-war world will be filled with consumer goods that everyone can buy. One advertisement explained that victory means Americans can walk into any store and buy anything you want. During the war, the United States engaged in a massive mobilization, not just of manpower, but of woman power, particularly to fill industrial jobs, since so many men were overseas. The Office of War Information, while it existed, encouraged women to go to work. Hollywood films glorified independent working women. Private advertising celebrated Rosie the Riveter, right, the we can do it lady. With 15 million men in the armed forces, by 1944, women made up more than 1/3 of the civilian labor force, and 350,000 of them served in auxiliary military units. Even though most women still held clerical and service jobs, new opportunities began to open up in industry, in professions, in government jobs that used to be only for men. Fully 1/3 of the workers in aircraft manufacturing and the shipyards were women. And for the first time, married women, older married women, like in their 30s and beyond, outnumbered young, single female workers. Now, women in the workforce meant that unions had to deal with issues like equal pay for equal work, and maternity leave, and child care facilities. Defense companies would sponsor swing bands and dances to boost worker morale. Sometimes they would arrange dates between male and female workers. And because it enjoyed that taste of independence and freedom, many women wanted to stay in the labor force once the war ended. Women also started to edge their way onto the battlefield, which, to be honest, we've done in every single war. But being able to openly put on a uniform and serve was different. The military in World War I allowed lots of women to serve as nurses. In this war, different jobs were open to them. And one of the reasons that the military allowed women to serve as more than nurses was because they needed to free up men. You know, the Army needs clerical workers. They need postal workers. They need all of that. But if a man is doing that position, it means he's not on the battlefield. If you can put a woman into that position, then it frees up that man to go and fight. By allowing women into the military to do those support jobs, more men were available for combat. 140,000 women served in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the WACs. Another 100,000 in the Waves, which was the Navy Auxiliary. 23,000 in the Marines, Women's Reserves. 76,000 in the traditional nursing positions. Now, some women in the military broke gender barriers as mechanics, as welders, as other skilled workers, but most were clerks or operators or other routine support staff. Women rarely saw combat except by accident, unless they were nurses. The traditional female path of nursing was actually the most dangerous that a woman could take, because nurses were often pretty close to the front lines. Now, black women were allowed to serve in the WACs. But they were segregated, just like black men. They were not allowed to serve in the Waves until 1944. About 10% of the WACs were African American. They lived and worked in segregated units. They were less likely to have access to skilled jobs. Women in the service in general faced a lot of ambivalence from the public. They were accused of drunkenness, of promiscuity. In fact, the WWIIs had a massive publicity campaign showing that their girls are ladies. They have a very high moral character. But to keep up that image, they had to treat women very differently from men. It was standard military procedure to distribute condoms to male soldiers, but female soldiers were not allowed to have any access to contraception because then they won't look like ladies anymore. Now, a different group, the WASPs, the Women's Air Service Pilots, they were able to take on a role that women hardly ever had in the military or as civilians. Now, being a pilot was considered a highly skilled job, and so letting women into this particular unit was threatening to a lot of people. It was so threatening that, in fact, the U.S. military refused to recognize them. They were considered civil servants without rank, without military pay, and they had to sew their own uniforms. But more than 25,000 women applied. The WASPs only accepted a little over 1,000. Now, men were accepted to the Army pilot training program without any prior experience, but all of the WASPs had civilian pilots' licenses when they joined. The WASPs were mostly white, not entirely. There were 2 Mexican-American women, 2 Chinese-American, 1 Native American. 1 African-American woman did apply, but she was strongly encouraged to withdraw her application to avoid any controversy. WASP pilots tested the planes before the men would fly them. They took part in maneuvers and training. 38 of them died over the course of the war testing new aircraft designs. The survivors were finally made eligible for veterans benefits in 1977. Congress gave them partial recognition for their service. Magazines, newspapers, popular society said that the United States needed to change its view of women, particularly women in the workforce. But change was very difficult. People seem to assume that this is a temporary necessity. It's not a permanent expansion of women's freedom. Advertisements assured women that, yes, you too are helping to fight for freedom, but their language always talked about sacrifice, not of rights or independence or self-determination. One union even said that there should be a law requiring women to be laid off once the war is over. And in fact, once the war ended, that's exactly what happened in the better-paying industries. The prospect of a consumer-rich future where every man has a good job, a good-paying job, where he can provide the American standard of living for his family, that was a real point of unity for all Americans, whether they were more liberal or more conservative. That promise of prosperity united 2 of the most important blueprints for a post-war world. One of them was called the American Century. It's sort of the more conservative viewpoint. The American Century was written by publisher Henry Luce in 1941, before we ever got into the war. And that was written both to prepare people for the potential for war, and also to get people used to the idea of post-war leadership. Henry Luce insisted that, even though Americans usually wanted to mind their own business and just take care of their country, history has thrust us into the role of the dominant world power, and we must be willing to take up that yoke, have to share our industrial products, must be willing to spread American ideals around the world. Luce said that after the war is over, American power and American values will create a world of prosperity produced by free enterprise. Now, we've had this idea of the United States spreading democracy and freedom ever since the Revolution. But traditionally, we thought of it as leading by example, not as actively imposing American values on the rest of the world. Luce's essay showed a great deal of foresight into what the post-war world and post-war America in particular would be like. But Henry Luce is conservative, and he really likes his very bombastic rhetoric. It's actually kind of a fun little essay to read. And so his opponents decided to come up with their own blueprint. Liberals and leftists responded to Luce's American Century with an essay written by Vice President Henry Wallace. Wallace wrote this, it was a speech, not an essay, called The Price of Free World Victory. Now, during the 1930s, Henry Wallace had been the Secretary of Agriculture. He was one of the most liberal New Dealers. And in 1941, he'd become Vice President. Now, Luce's more conservative vision of an American century had business dominant. Wallace, on the other hand, predicted that this will be a century of the common man. He said that the world will be marked by cooperation between countries, not necessarily rule by any single power. He said that governments will cooperate and work together to fight hunger and illiteracy and poverty. Now, Luce and Wallace both used the rhetoric of freedom. Luce had this very confident vision of worldwide free enterprise. Wallace had this vision of like a global New Deal. But they had one thing in common. Both of them expected that the United States would be the leader in the world, that we would get involved in the international community. And they both believed that the United States should be a model for other countries to follow. And of course, neither of them considered that other nations might have developed their own ideas for how to proceed. The way to develop post-war prosperity was a question that occupied a lot of the U.S. government. In 1942 and 1943, the National Resources Planning Board came up with this blueprint for a peacetime economy based on full employment, an expanded welfare state, and supporting the American standard of living. They called for an economic Bill of Rights that would include all Americans in an expanded Social Security system, guaranteed access to education, health care, adequate housing, jobs for every able-bodied adult. Now, FDR knew that a large majority of Americans would support things like guaranteed employment. So in 1944, he very tentatively began to support this economic Bill of Rights. But during the election of '44, he didn't talk a whole lot about it. War's still going on. FDR is still very preoccupied with the war, and by that point, he knows that he's dying. He replaced Henry Wallace, his very liberal vice president, with Harry Truman. Truman was a little-known, much more conservative senator from Missouri. In fact, he's from right around this area. Congress did not enact the Economic Bill of Rights, but it did take some of the ideas from it and apply it to another law, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, also known as the GI Bill. In 1944, Congress extended all sorts of economic protections to returning veterans, like unemployment insurance, educational scholarships, low-interest home loans, and pensions, and job training. This is one of the most far-reaching pieces of social legislation in American history. It was aimed partly at rewarding members of the military for their service, and partly at preventing widespread unemployment that had happened immediately after World War I. We don't want to get dragged back into the Depression. This law profoundly shaped American society. By 1946, the year after the war, over 1 million veterans were going to college under the GI Bill. They made up half of all college enrollment. And most of these guys were men who did not come from college-educated families. Most of these guys would not have been able to go to school without the GI Bill. But with it, they were able to get college educations. They were able to move into the middle class, something that their parents were never able to do. Almost 4 million returning veterans got home mortgages, which meant jobs in construction, jobs in plumbing, jobs in carpet laying and roofing, and consumer production. It spurred a post-war housing boom, helped to create the masses of suburbs that we have now. The GI Bill was also a symbol of the American belief that the government should have a responsibility to maintain living standards and employment. Now, the idea of freedom as a defining characteristic of American life had implications that went far beyond wartime. World War II reshaped the way the United States thought of itself as a people. The struggle against Nazism and their theory of a master race and racial superiority made old ideas about racial and ethnic inequality look very bad. The pluralist vision of America that had come out of the Popular Front, that became part of our official rhetoric. The government insisted that it's not just the four freedoms that set us apart from our enemies. It's also the idea that all Americans from all races and all backgrounds can enjoy those freedoms equally. We began to say that racism was the enemy's philosophy, that being an American meant tolerance and diversity and equality. And by the end of the war, most European immigrant groups had become fully accepted as loyal, patriotic Americans. Biologists and social scientists were kind of horrified at the way that Nazis used their ideas about inborn racial differences. And overnight, almost, the scientific community turned their back on it. They abandoned the belief in a link between race and culture and intelligence. By the end of the war, racism and nativism had lost most of its intellectual respectability. But the rhetoric didn't always match the facts. Intolerance certainly did not disappear from American life. Like the Norman Rockwell paintings of the Four Freedoms, one woman wrote into the Saturday Evening Post to complain that the Freedom of Worship painting had too many foreign-looking people in it. There was still anti-Semitism. That contributed to the unwillingness of some people to help Jewish refugees. Nonetheless, the war made millions of ethnic European Americans feel fully American for the first time. For non-white groups, though, the war was a lot more ambiguous. On the eve of Pearl Harbor, racial barriers were still really deeply entrenched. Many black Americans were still trapped in segregation. Asians could not immigrate to the United States. They could not become naturalized citizens, although their children born here were born citizens. More than 400,000 Mexican Americans have been sent back to Mexico. Saying sent back is not even correct. A good half of them were native-born American citizens, so they were sent to Mexico. Most Native Americans still lived in pretty dismal poverty on the reservations. But the war set in motion changes that would have a large impact on post-war America. In 1942, Congress created the Bracero program. It brought tens of thousands of contract Mexican laborers to the United States, mostly to work on the farms as migrant workers. It was supposed to be a temporary response to a labor shortage. The program actually lasted for 22 years. It didn't end until 1964. Now, the Bracero program did reinforce the idea that new immigrants from Mexico were an unskilled labor force. But wartime employment opened up a lot of opportunities for second-generation Mexican Americans. Hundreds of thousands of men and women left ethnic neighborhoods to work in defense industries, to serve in the military, where they were fighting in integrated units. A new Chicano culture was born, this fusion of pride in their Mexican heritage and pride in what they're doing in the United States came together in this era. And contact with other groups sparked a rise in interethnic marriages. The war also brought many American Indians closer to the mainstream. About 25,000 Native men served in the Army, including the code talkers. Typically, these are remembered as Navajo code talkers. They weren't entirely Navajo, though. In fact, there were several gentlemen from this part of Oklahoma, members of the Seneca Nation, who served as code talkers as well. They would transmit messages in their languages. The Japanese can't translate them. One of the most famous Native veterans of the war was Ira Hayes. He's a member of the Pima Nation. He was part of the flag raising on Iwo Jima. More than 50,000 Natives left the reservations to get jobs in war industries. But the reservations didn't share in wartime prosperity, and Native veterans discovered that GI Bill benefits did not extend to them if they returned to the reservations. And the experience of Asian Americans in the war was kind of odd. More than 50,000 Asian Americans, the children of immigrants, fought in the Army, mostly in all Asian units. Now, China was our ally in the Pacific War. So in 1943, Congress finally removed the Chinese Exclusion Act. They allowed Chinese people to immigrate to the United States. Now, the quota was only 105 people a year, so it's really not much more than a gesture. But it's a nice gesture. More important were the large numbers of Chinese Americans fighting in the U.S. military, as well as the gigantic Chinese army that's fighting Japan in China itself. The image of the Chinese as gallant warriors defending their country against aggression, that made some people question and reevaluate the old racial stereotypes. And like Mexican Americans, large numbers of Chinese Americans moved out of their ethnic neighborhoods to work alongside whites in the war industries. The experience of Japanese Americans was very different. Many Americans saw the war against Germany as an ideological war, but they saw the fight in the Pacific as a race war. And to an extent the Japanese did as well. Japanese propaganda depicted Americans as contaminated by diversity, as opposed to the racially pure Japanese. In the United States, the long-standing prejudice against Asian people in general and the attack on Pearl Harbor combined to produce a tremendous amount of hate, not just toward Japan, but toward native-born Japanese Americans. Government propaganda and war films portrayed the Japanese as subhumans, as rats and dogs and snakes. Our propaganda blamed German aggression on Hitler. They're bullied by Hitler. He's a tyrant. He's forcing them to do this. But they blame Japanese aggression on the character, the inherent qualities of Japanese people, saying that the Japanese are inherently violent. About 70% of Japanese Americans in the continental United States lived in California, and they dominated vegetable farming, especially down in the Los Angeles area. About a third of them were first-generation immigrants. They came over before the immigration ban. But that means that 2/3 of them were American-born, and therefore native-born U.S. citizens. Most of them only spoke English. They'd never been to Japan. They tried to assimilate. But the Japanese American community couldn't stand alone against the kind of hate that was being thrown at them. The U.S. government, in many ways, bent over backwards to include German Americans and Italian Americans in the war effort. There were more than 800,000 German and Italian citizens in the United States, and only a handful of them were ever arrested for spying over the course of the war. And when they were arrested, they were at least charged with a crime. But the government and mainstream America seemed to view every person of Japanese descent as a potential spy. The West Coast, in particular, had a long history of hostility toward the Japanese, and when the war started, there was quite a bit of fear of a potential Japanese invasion on the West Coast. And also, some powerful landowners saw the chance to take over Japanese American property, especially the farms. The military authority in California persuaded Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 9066 in February of '42. Executive Order 9066 ordered the expulsion of all persons of Japanese descent from the West Coast. In the spring and summer of '42, authorities removed more than 110,000 men, women, and children, 2/3 of them native-born U.S. citizens, and placed them in internment camps far from their homes. George Takei, who wrote The Chill Winds of Tule Lake, which you read, was initially moved from Los Angeles to Arkansas before his entire family, and he's like 6 or 7 years old when this happens, was sent to a high-security prison at Tule Lake in Northern California. Now, Executive Order 9066 did not apply to Japanese ethnics living in Hawaii. Doesn't that seem weird? I mean, that is the place, after all, that the Japanese had already attacked. We know that they are willing and able to do it. The reason it didn't apply there is because almost half of the population of Hawaii, the workforce of Hawaii, was Japanese American. The economy of Hawaii will collapse, losing that much of its workforce. And also, the Japanese in Hawaii tended to be tenant farmers rather than landowners. Internment revealed how very easily war can undermine basic freedoms. There were no court hearings. I mean, the people who were rounded up under this order were never actually charged with a crime unless they refused to go, like Fred Korematsu. There was no due process of law. There was no habeas corpus. Nobody really protested on their behalf. The press almost unanimously supported this policy. There was only one national political figure who spoke against it, Senator Taft from Ohio. Groups that were supposed to be committed to civil rights, like the Communist Party and the NAACP and the American Jewish Committee, they either supported this law or they just were silent. And the courts refused to help. In 1944, in Korematsu v. United States, the Supreme Court denied the appeal of a native-born Japanese-American citizen who had been arrested for refusing to present himself for internment. Speaking for the majority, Justice Hugo Black, who was usually a pretty decent defender of human rights, somehow came to the conclusion that an order applying only to people of Japanese descent was not a racially based order. And the mental gymnastics he had to have gone through to come up with that are just mind-boggling to me. The Supreme Court to date has never overturned that decision. As you read in Justice Jackson's dissent, it lies like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of national security. Of course, even after interning these people on suspicion of being Japanese, the government still expected them to be good citizens. They sold war bonds to the internees. They established a loyalty oath program. They expected these people to swear allegiance to the government that had imprisoned them without charge. About 200 young Japanese American men were sent to prison for refusing to be drafted into the army. But about 20,000 did volunteer to join the military, most of them right out of the camps. Another 13,000 joined from Hawaii. These young men at the bottom, they're the 442nd, or part of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. That was an entirely Asian American unit, mostly Japanese American, that fought in the European theater. 3,800 troops were part of the 442nd. They became the most highly decorated unit in the history of the U.S. military. 18,000 individual decorations, including 5,200 Bronze Stars, which means that some of them got more than one. 21 Congressional Medals of Honor, 9,486 Purple Hearts. And you know how you get a Purple Heart, right? You get wounded. So basically, these dudes took like 3 bullets each and kept fighting. I suspect that they had something to prove. After the war, there was a long campaign to get the government to acknowledge that internment was wrong. In 1988, Congress apologized for internment and provided $20,000 to each of the surviving victims. Because when they were taken to these camps, they took what they could carry, and they lost everything else. In 1983, a San Francisco district court judge vacated Fred Korematsu's conviction. And 15 years later, President Clinton awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, not just because of his fight against internment, but because he went on to be a lifelong civil rights activist. Now, the treatment of Japanese Americans showed the stubborn hold that racism had on American life. But the wartime talk of freedom gave hope for a transformation to a lot of African Americans. The war spurred a movement of the black population out of the rural South into the industrial North and West, just like during World War I. This one was even bigger, though. About 700,000 people took part in this particular migration. When World War II started, the Army, Air Force, and the Marines had no black members. The Army restricted the number of black enlistees they would take. There were only 5 black officers in the entire Army. 3 of them were chaplains. The Navy would only allow African Americans to serve as cooks and waiters. But they served anyway. During the war, more than 1 million black Americans served in the armed forces. They did so in segregated units, mostly confined to construction and transport and other non-combat tasks. But there were some exceptions. Like these gentlemen were part of the 332nd Fighter Group, also known as the Tuskegee Airmen. They're one of the exceptions. They escorted bombers into enemy territory in North Africa and in the European theater. Bombers were really unwieldy, desperately unmaneuverable, so you can't send one into enemy territory by itself or it'll get shot down immediately. It's got to have this escort, and that's what the Tuskegee Airmen did. Many northern black draftees were sent to the South for their military training, where they were kind of shocked at their treatment. They weren't allowed to go into movie theaters or into servicemen's clubs on their own basis, and they didn't really want to go into the towns because they were often abused. Black soldiers up at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas pointed out that Nazi prisoners of war were treated better and had more freedom than black American soldiers did. And that's absolutely true. Up at Leavenworth, one of the rewards for good behavior on the part of these prisoners of war was that they could go into Leavenworth on the weekend and go have lunch in a restaurant, see a movie. But Leavenworth was a segregated town, so U.S. troops guarding these Nazis had to stand outside the restaurants and outside the movie theaters while the prisoners of war were enjoying themselves. After the war, the local authorities in charge of the GI Bill benefits would often only let black veterans use their educational benefits at segregated schools, use their job training benefits only for unskilled work or low-wage service jobs. In 1942, the Army did a public opinion poll and found that the vast majority of white Americans were unaware that there was any such thing as a race problem. They were convinced that black Americans were perfectly happy. Well, they were wrong. The war years saw the birth of the modern civil rights movement. Angered by the almost complete exclusion of black workers from the war industries, one community leader, A. Philip Randolph, called for a march on Washington. They demanded access to defense employment, an end to segregation, once again a national anti-lynching law, which, by the way, we still don't have. Randolph used FDR's own rhetoric against him. Randolph pointed out that racial discrimination was undemocratic, un-American, and pro-Hitler. To persuade Randolph to call off the march, Roosevelt issued another executive order, 8802. It banned discrimination in defense jobs. If you get a government contract to produce anything for the military, you cannot discriminate on the basis of race. And they had also established the first Fair Employment Practices Commission. Now, the FEPC was basically just an investigative agency. It didn't have any power to enforce, but just the fact that it existed was a pretty big shift in public policy. It began to hold hearings that exposed such deeply ingrained racism that at first the people they were interviewing just freely admitted that they were doing it. Sure, our want ads specify what race we want to hire as janitors and which we want as skilled jobs. Well, we're not supposed to do that? Nobody told me. The FEPC was the first federal agency, really since Reconstruction, to campaign for equal job opportunities for black Americans. And they played an important role in opening those jobs to black workers. Like at the start of the war, About 100,000 aircraft workers, fewer than 300 were black. Well, in Southern California, after the establishment of the FEPC, Lockheed Aircraft began, in particular, to purposefully recruit African American workers. By 1944, more than 1 million black Americans, 300,000 of them women, held manufacturing jobs. And if you've got a manufacturing job, what can you do that you can't do if you're a farm worker or a domestic servant? You can pay into pensions and unemployment and Social Security. So for the first time, they've got access to that. During the war, NAACP membership grew from 50,000 to almost 500,000. Civil rights groups began to hold sit-ins to integrate restaurants and theaters in the North. Not quite ready to do it in the South yet. The NAACP and the American Jewish Committee cooperated closely in trying to end discrimination in jobs and housing and education. The CIO made significant efforts to organize black workers and get them access to skilled positions. And during the war, the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, became the most racially integrated labor organization since the Knights of Labor back in the 1880s. This new black militancy, though, created a bit of a crisis for white Southerners who considered themselves moderates. In 1944, the University of North Carolina Press published a book of essays by 14 prominent black leaders. It was called What the Negro Wants. And virtually every essay called for protection of the right to vote, into segregation, and access to the American standard of living. Moderate Southerners who like to think of themselves as better than their more conservative brethren found themselves kind of hardening their stance against African Americans. By 1945, though, support for racial justice began to take its place on the liberal agenda. Now, FDR himself, just like during the New Deal, really didn't talk about this much. But many members of his own cabinet insisted that racial discrimination needed to be confronted head-on through federal legislation. And the wartime vision of freedom and liberty and integration formed a bridge between the New Deal of the 30s, the Civil Rights Movement of the 50s, and the Great Society of the 60s. By the beginning of 1945, Allied victory seemed basically assured. In December of 44, Hitler launched this kind of desperate gamble, a surprise attack in northern France, southern Belgium, that pushed Allied forces back by a good 50 miles. It created a bulge in the battle lines, and that today is known as the Battle of the Bulge. It lasted for more than a month, produced more than 70,000 American casualties. By March, though, U.S. troops were crossing over the Rhine River, entering the industrial heartland of Germany. The Soviets are coming in from the east, and Hitler ate his own bullet about 30 seconds before the Soviets took Berlin. The 8th of May, VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, formally ended the war against Germany. The war against Italy had effectively ended back in 43, when the Italians ran Mussolini out of office. Mussolini hid for the next 2 years. He ran to the Germans for protection. But the Italians caught up with him in 45, shot him many, many times, and then hung his body by the hills at a gas station outside of Milan. So the war in Europe is over, and we're focusing on the Pacific. Now, FDR won his 4th election in 1944, but he didn't live to see Allied victory, not even VE Day. He died of a stroke on April 12, 1945. His vice president, Harry Truman from Missouri, had to make one of the most momentous decisions ever confronted by a U.S. president, whether to use an absolutely horrific new weapon against Japan. The existence of the atomic bomb was such a closely guarded secret that Truman didn't even know it was being developed until he took office as president. Then the Secretary of War pulled him aside and informed him that they were working on this. He called it the most terrible weapon ever known in human history. Now, the atomic bomb is, to get nerdy on you, a practical example of the special theory of relativity, which was developed by Albert Einstein. Einstein had lived in Germany. He fled Germany in 1933 when Hitler first came to power. And in 1939, Einstein warned FDR that Nazi scientists were probably trying to develop an atomic weapon, and he urged the president to do the same. The following year, 1940, FDR authorized the Manhattan Project, which worked on the atomic bomb through World War II. In July of 1945, the weapon was successfully tested in the New Mexico desert. Interesting little thing, you know, the United States has only been working on the atomic bomb for 5 years. The Germans have had, at least since 1939 and probably sooner than that, to be working on it. And yet the United States finished first. Part of it is because the Germans refused to use Einstein's own calculations that he had been working on. And the reason they wouldn't use it is because Einstein was Jewish. So their rampant bigotry cost them the use of a weapon. Thank God. On August 6, 1945, an American plane dropped an atomic bomb that detonated over the city of Hiroshima, Japan. Hiroshima was chosen, it was one of several possible targets, and they were all chosen because up to that point they hadn't been severely damaged. We wanted a blank slate to be able to measure exactly how much damage could be done with this one weapon. Well, these pictures show you how much damage can be done. In an instant, nearly every building in the city was destroyed. Approximately 70,000 people died instantly. Because atomic bombs release deadly radiation, the death toll kept rising. By the end of the year, it was more than 140,000, and thousands more died over the next 5 years. On August 9, 1945, the United States exploded a second bomb over Nagasaki. Same result, killed another 70,000 people instantly. On the same day that happened, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, that territory in China that Japan had held since 1931. Within a week, Japan surrendered. And because of the enormous cost in civilian lives, more than twice the American military fatalities in the entire Pacific War were lost in these two bombs. The use of the bomb remains very controversial. The Japanese had fought ferociously throughout the war, and especially at the end, when they were being driven back further and further from one Pacific island to another. Truman's advisors warned him that if it comes down to the United States having to invade Japan, it could cost 250,000 American lives. But plans for that invasion didn't see it starting until at least early 1946. And there was quite a bit of evidence that Japan was planning to surrender long before it would come to that. Several Japanese officials were already supporting surrender as long as the emperor could stay on the throne. The Japanese economy was crippled, its fleet was all but destroyed, and now with the Soviets coming in, they're going to have to fight on two fronts. Some of the scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project told Truman just to demonstrate the bomb. Find an uninhabited island and blow the shit out of that. Just kind of show off what we can do if we want to. But that's not the path that Truman chose. And to be honest, dropping the bomb was the logical culmination in the way that this war was fought. All wars inflict suffering on non-combatants. But World War II, the civilian populations were explicitly and ruthlessly targeted. Back in the First World War, 90% of the deaths were military personnel. But of the 50 million people who died in World War II, 40% were civilians. Germany's race war alone killed millions of people, and Germany repeatedly bombed London and other civilian, heavily populated cities. And the Allies did the same. In fact, we were kind of better at it. Firebombed the hell out of Dresden, Germany in 1945, killed 100,000 people, mostly women and children and elderly men. On March 9th, we bombed Tokyo, again about 100,000 people. And the treatment of civilian populations during the post-war occupation we're not even going to get into that. As the war raged on, the leaders of the major Allied nations met repeatedly to come up with a plan for the post-war world. Churchill from the UK, Roosevelt from the US, and Stalin from the USSR met at Tehran in Iran in 1943 and at Yalta in the southern Soviet Union, what is today Ukraine, early in 1945 to hammer out some post-war agreements. Now by this point, the Soviets, they're on the German border. They are going to be the first nation in Germany. So Stalin was operating from a position of significant power. Roosevelt spent a lot of time negotiating with Stalin, appeasing Stalin, way more than he did with Churchill. Now, to some extent, that reflected Britain's decline in stature. But it was also part of Roosevelt's worry that Britain will use victory to gobble up more empire, like it did after World War I. Roosevelt also realized that the Soviets would control Eastern Europe at the end of the war. There is zero way around that. If the Allies are going to win, the Soviets will have to take Eastern Europe back from Hitler, and once they have it, they're going to keep it. Roosevelt got Stalin to agree that the Soviets would declare war on Japan once Hitler was defeated. And they did keep that agreement. Stalin also agreed that he would not force communist governments on the Eastern European nations that he controlled. He did not keep that agreement. The Yalta Conference was the high water mark of American-Soviet relations. We are never going to get along with them as well as we do right here. But Yalta also planted the seeds of conflict, because once the war is over, the United States is going to seriously rethink letting the Soviets have that much territorial control. After VE Day, Truman met with Stalin and Churchill at Potsdam, near Berlin, and they came up with a military administration for Germany and agreed to place top Nazi leaders on trial for war crimes. And Great Britain started to come out of these talks with less and less. At the Bretton Woods Conference, representatives from 45 different nations decided that they no longer wanted the British pound to be the currency of international trade, which it had been for centuries at this point. They replaced it instead with the American dollar. These conferences also created things like the World Bank, which was supposed to loan money to developing countries, and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, which had the very vague goal of preventing another worldwide depression. Both of these institutions still exist. Early in the war, the Allies had also agreed that they would chuck the League of Nations, which was useless, and create something else. In a '44 conference, they established the structure of the United Nations. The United Nations, still today, has a General Assembly, which is basically a discussion forum. Every member nation has an equal voice. And then there is a Security Council, and that's responsible for maintaining world peace. There are rotating memberships in the Security Council. Smaller nations can have 2- or 3-year terms on the Security Council, but there are 5 permanent members, the biggest allies: the United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. They're the 5 biggest allies of World War II. Each of them has veto power. One no vote from one of those nations on the Security Council can stop any military action that the United Nations wants to take. Which is why, you look around the world and you're like, well, why did the United Nations intervene here, but they're not going to intervene here? It's because one of those permanent members has said no for some reason or another. Like Syria. The United Nations is not going to get involved in Syria because Syria buys a lot of weapons from Russia and from China, and they are consistently voting no. In June of '45, representatives from 51 countries met up in San Francisco to hammer out the United Nations Charter, which outlawed using force or the threat of force as a means of settling international conflict. To some extent, it has worked better than the situation we had before. In July, the United States Senate endorsed the charter. You know, with the League of Nations, there had been that nasty argument over whether or not we should, under what conditions we should, and ultimately we never did. It was really easy to get us to join the League of Nations. Only 2 members of the Senate voted against it. World War II ended with the United States as the world's dominant power. But once again, peace did not create an era of international harmony. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe created a division that will turn into the Cold War. The atomic bomb left a severe legacy of fear, and it remained to be seen exactly how seriously the Allies would take their wartime rhetoric of freedom. Now, Allied victory saved the world from a living nightmare, but dispute over the nature of freedom and who it applied to will foretell future wars and social problems to come. And we'll talk about how some of that kicks off in the next lecture over the start of the Cold War.